Rose here. Thanks for tuning in again. A quick catch-up. We've seen how Joseph Rutherford bought Bible books sold by Charles Russell's Bible students in 1894, but he didn't get baptized until 12 years later in 1906. Even though Rutherford didn't live in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, Rutherford somehow became the organization's advising attorney in Pennsylvania in 1906, to actually becoming Russell's personal attorney the following year in 1907. We went over the reason the Watchtower Publishing Company was moved from Pennsylvania to New York. Rutherford was then able to go from being the Watchtower's leading attorney to becoming a member of the board directing the publishing company, one of the men who worked with Russell making all decisions for the publishing company. But when Charles Russell died, it left a vacancy for a new president. Charles' will had been sealed in his safe since 1910. Take a wild guess at who his attorney was that wrote the will up. Yes, Joseph Rutherford. So we know that everything in that will would have been very well known by the man who wrote it up. So think of the next few podcast videos as a mystery case going forward. Instead of, how did someone get away with murder, you're going to see how an attorney got away with taking over a publishing company. And at the end of this video, I'm going to ask certain questions because some things just don't make sense unless certain men had been talking together prior to Russell's death. Was there a coup already planned to take over the publishing company? Maybe after the next few pod videos, you'll be able to answer that. But before I go on, please make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons to help this video go out to a larger audience. Algorithms and all. And I always enjoy reading your comments. Something important to remember, as we learned in the last podcast video, was that on many occasions, Charles Russell had to diffuse issues among the brothers at the Bethel home that were caused by William Van Amberg, Joseph Rutherford, and Alexander Macmillan regarding the publishing company as a business, as well as the Bible doctrines that went into the publications. And remember those names: Joseph Rutherford, Alexander Macmillan, and William Van Amberg, because they're going to be coming up quite a lot. We learned that Russell had made arrangements for Paul Johnson to serve the Bible students in Britain due to what was going on with some of the brothers there. Remember, Paul Johnson was the man Charles Russell looked to for deep biblical discussions. We learned that Rutherford was with Paul Johnson the day before Russell's death on October 30th. But now Russell had died, and Rutherford and Johnson, respectively, were on their way back to New York. But back in New York, there are already problems happening. The day after Russell's death, Alexander Macmillan, who wasn't even on the board of directors, not only called a meeting with the board, but he went so far as to not allow Vice President Ritchie to rightly take the president's chair to lead the board. Again, 2 words, vice president. Ritchie was the vice president, so why did Macmillan, who isn't even on the board, feel he had the right to call a meeting and then treat Ritchie that way? Why would he say that the president's chair belonged to the judge? Why did Macmillan say the treasurer, William Van Amberg, should take the lead instead? I'm telling you, look to see what those men did immediately after Charles Russell's death. Now, side note here, Macmillan was the one who talked Rutherford into getting baptized in 1906. In fact, Macmillan was the one who baptized Rutherford. Rutherford and Johnson ended up arriving at Bethel the same day, November 1st. Early that morning, Rutherford approached Johnson and asked him if there was some indication in Scripture showing that Russell would have a successor. Johnson told him he didn't know, but once he went over the Scriptures, Johnson would get back to Rutherford with the answer to that question. And he did, 2 days later on November 3rd. Johnson explained that Russell died without giving the penny. He was referring to the parable at Luke 16. Johnson felt that since Russell died without giving the penny, he wasn't the actual steward. So yes, there would be a successor. I know, none of that made sense to me either. But Rutherford wanted to know who Johnson thought that successor would be. Johnson said he didn't know. But a cable message sent not too long after this conversation will show you that Johnson had his sights on becoming that faithful slave or steward. And little did Johnson know, Rutherford felt the same way, only about himself. So knowing some of the background now, the following might make a little bit more sense. On the same day that Rutherford and Johnson spoke about the penny parable, November 3rd, 1916, 3 days after Russell's death, during the midday meal, Russell's will, which had been sealed since 1910, was taken out of Russell's office safe by the Society's secretary, Brother Van Amberg, who told everyone that Russell had sealed it in 1910 and had never touched it since. He then handed the will to Paul Johnson. Now this is notable here. Van Amberg handed the will to Paul Johnson, not Joseph Rutherford, Russell's attorney, or the Society's attorney, or even the vice president, Ritchie, to open it and read it aloud to the Bethel family, which at the time were made up between 75 to 100 Bethel family members. That tells me something. Paul Johnson was apparently very highly respected among the Bethel family. Well, after the will was read, there were quite a few very upset people because of what came out in the will. Russell had a couple of surprises that people didn't know, but that's for the next podcast video. This one's going about Johnson and Rutherford. So right now, I'm pretty sure it was very somber in the Bethel home, but politics never seemed to stop. Let's start at Russell's memorial, which was held November 10th. Brother Alexander McMillan goes up to Brother Hoskins, who is a member of the board of directors, and McMillan wasn't. McMillan tells Hoskins, "Brother, I don't think you have the strength of character sufficient to do what I have to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that every one of you brothers, except for brothers Rutherford and Van Amberg, ought to resign and give a chance for some decent men who know some things to be put in your places. There's not one of you fit to manage anything, and you ought to resign, and if you don't resign, you will, every one of you, get kicked out." Again, McMillan was not even on the board at that time, so why did he feel so empowered to say something like that to a board member? In fact, why would he say anything like that to another brother? Kicking them out of Bethel? Well, prior to Brother Johnson leaving, he had spoken to Brother Ritchie. Remember, Brother Ritchie was the vice president of the publishing company who McMillan would not allow to be in charge. Brother Ritchie explained to Johnson that both he and other brothers wanted him, Paul Johnson, to become the next president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. He was very highly respected, highly educated, and very well versed in the Bible. And Ritchie wasn't the only one who felt this way. On November 5th, H.C. Rockwell told Paul Johnson that he and other brothers wanted him to become the Society's new president. In fact, Rockwell went so far as to tell Johnson that he would resign as the director so that Johnson could be elected in his place to the board and therefore be eligible to become president at the upcoming annual election that was going to take place in January, just 2 months from then. But Johnson didn't want the presidency. He wanted to take care of the problems that were happening in Britain that he had talked to Russell about. So before leaving for England, he arranged, now this is very important, Johnson arranged for his 416 voting shares he had in the Watchtower Corporation to be used to vote for Rutherford. Just as with all shareholders of any corporation, the amount of voting shares you have affects the weight of your vote. So Johnson was here giving his full support for Rutherford to become president of the publishing company. But you're going to see how Johnson came to regret doing that. There was already trouble brewing that nobody saw coming. But again, that's for next time. Back to Johnson. Johnson wanted to take care of the problems in England, and that was very important to him. They were getting upsetting reports coming in from the England branch. Some of the managers in London, who were also elders in the congregations, were divided as to how the congregation should function. Out of the 18 elders, 11 wanted more freedom from Brooklyn headquarters. Those 11 brothers were seeking to separate themselves from Russell's controllership and authoritarian leanings. But 7 elders were trying to prevent that. So, the board of directors elected Ritchie, Rutherford, and Macmillan and assigned them to make the arrangements for Johnson to go to Britain. As you see from the letter that Rutherford dictated and Ritchie and Van Amberg signed as both the vice president and the secretary of the society. And through this letter, Johnson was pretty much given the authority of what a branch overseer would have. He was sent to go and clean house within the congregation, possibly dismissing some from the publishing company as well. And this letter showed he had the full backing of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the organization. So he thought. Something else was going on in 1916. World War I, and war was raging in Europe. Britain had been at war for more than 2 years, and that January, they had passed the first Military Service Act, pretty much instituting a draft into the military. Any single man between 18 and 41 would be drafted, and then a second act was passed 4 months later in May, extending that to married men. So you can imagine how the brothers in Britain were feeling at that point. A raging war, and now a draft. By August of that year, 1916, there were already 60 Bible students in prison for refusing military orders. Brother Johnson was determined to encourage the brothers because of this, and he also needed to take care of these brothers who were being very divisive in the congregations. Johnson worked very hard. He gave over 100 talks in different congregations, as well as 32 public discourses, like a circuit assembly overseer would do today. He basically worked to the point that it actually affected his health. The Watchtower publishing business was known under another name in England. It was known as the International Bible Student Association, IBSA for short. Another side note, IBSA is still under the Watchtower organization's umbrella of different sub-entities the organization uses. The Watchtower organization currently uses IBSA to buy and sell properties around the world. When I started looking at these properties, it really blew my mind. But anyhow, remember, in order to work at the printing company in any capacity, you had to be anointed, in other words, baptized following Russell's teachings. So many in the congregation also sat on the board for the Britain branch regarding affairs of the printing factory, as well as any problems within the congregations, the ecclesia. These elders and managers were voted in by the brothers and sisters in their congregations. That's how it worked back then, before Rutherford changed everything. So Paul Johnson comes in, much like a branch representative would, on November 30th, 1916. He confronts the 11 elders on their position regarding their stance against Pastor Charles Taze Russell, and he condemns all 11 of them. But they refused to change their position. And when the elders refused to change their position, he got mad. So on December 3rd, he sent his first batch of letters to the executive committee in New York, members on the board. He wrote to them that he disapproved of Brother Shern and Brother Crawford's actions. On December 20th, Johnson was working with the managers or elders in preparation for the upcoming convention. Johnson noted that the local elders were given most of the talks. He asked why weren't any of the managers part of the program. He wanted to know why none of these brothers felt that they needed to give talks. And he also wanted to know why the baptism was taking place the evening before the convention began. The candidates wouldn't be able to hear the talk prior to that baptism. So he wanted all of that changed. But the managers didn't want to change the program. So Johnson called a special managers meeting and insisted that the program be revised exactly as he had stated. But he was told that would have to be discussed among the managers or the elders. Now imagine a room full of elders saying that to a representative from the branch today. Johnson just got mad and he told the brothers, do it. He reminded them that he was the society's special representative. 2 days later, on December 22nd, Johnson tried to revise the program himself, but it was too short of notice, so the program wasn't changed, and it was handed out with no revisions made. However, there were more than 600 Bible students who attended that convention, and Johnson was given the most prominent places on the program. The following week, during the meeting on December 31st and January 1st, because Brother Shern and Brother Crawford would not change their biblical stance regarding Pastor Russell and were trying to completely separate their finances from the Brooklyn headquarters in New York, Brother Johnson advised the congregations that the two men not stand for election to eldership in the upcoming election to be held in the tabernacle later that month. If they lost their positions, they would not be able to be managers of the IPSC company. Johnson told the congregation that because of what these men were proposing, he felt that they could not rightly be leaders in the congregation if they weren't willing to listen to their leader, Charles Russell. And as not to miss anything that these brothers might have been guilty of, Johnson asked another brother, Brother Henry, to draw up a list of either Bethel family or Watchtower offenses committed by Shern and Crawford. Henry did and presented these offenses to the congregations at a midweek meeting Monday, January 8th. The annual election took more than just one session. On Sunday, January 14th, nominations for elders were made, and the actual election was set for January 21st. Now, Johnson was absent at both of these meetings because, like a branch representative, he did have other matters to take care of in other congregations. So what Johnson did in his absence at that meeting was he had Brother Jesse Henry tell the congregation that as the society's commissioner, the branch representative sent to take care of the issue at hand, he, Paul Johnson, disapproved of re-electing Brothers Shern and Crawford due to their position that they had taken in opposition to Pastor Russell. And that same day, Johnson wrote a report to Brooklyn that both Brother Shern and Brother Crawford be dismissed as office managers. Johnson viewed them as mismanagers because of their biblical view stance on Russell. The following Sunday, on January 28th, Johnson was requested to give his personal view of the matter. So on January 28th, Johnson gets up on the stage and announces to all in the audience that Brothers Shern and Brothers Crawford had deliberately deceived their fellow elders regarding Pastor Russell. He announced that they were forever cut off from the little flock. As the society's commissioner, Johnson had been given the authority to do so. Johnson then had the church secretary read the letter that Rutherford had dictated and that was signed by Ritchie and Van Amberg, and this offended a lot of people. The following Sunday, February 4th, the congregation voted that Brother Shern and Brother Crawford would not be voted as elders until another church meeting could be held when they could further investigate the accusations being made against them, as well as listen to the facts given by Brother Johnson. So this was done again at the tabernacle on Sunday, February 18th. Now, Brother Shern and Brother Crawford were highly respected elders in that area. There were about 30 or 40 brothers and sisters that wrote back to Brooklyn Bethel, cabling Brother Rutherford, the newly instituted president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Yes, Rutherford got elected as president while all of this was happening in England. But again, that's for next time, because that's a whole other story in itself. Well, these brothers and sisters wrote and cabled Brother Rutherford stating their extreme dissatisfaction at what Johnson had done. In Paul Johnson's book, Harvest Siftings Reviewed, Johnson claimed those letters aroused Brother Rutherford's opposition to him. Johnson stating that there was opposition against him by Rutherford. After the January 28th infamous meeting, Brothers Shern and Crawford decided to take the offensive. So on February 3rd, they attempted to take the steps set out in Matthew 18:15 through 18. They each wrote Brother Johnson a short note outlining Matthew 18 and asked if Brother Johnson was ready to apologize. Well, Johnson agreed to meet with them. However, as you can imagine, Brother Shern and Brother Crawford weren't going to take any chances and so brought witnesses just in case. Well, Johnson told these witnesses that his course of action was that as set forth to him as the Society's commissioner and therefore did not come under the scope of Matthew 18. Johnson told the brothers that the only ones who could review the brothers' pertinent acts was the board of directors in Brooklyn, New York. Johnson's answers to both Shern and Crawford was to dismiss them as managers. See, Johnson felt that the fact that Shern and Crawford even actually attempted to apply Matthew 18 to him as an official representative of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, well, that was just offensive. So after speaking with Brother Henry, Johnson told Shern and Crawford to leave the office at once and the Bethel premises as soon as possible, turning over to Brother Johnson all of the societies and the associations, monies, documents, and papers. Well, both Shern and Crawford accepted Johnson's dismissal at the Britain Tabernacle. But then Johnson cabled back to Brooklyn about what he had done, how he had dismissed them from the congregation and as managements. However, Brother Crawford was still the treasurer of the International Bible Student Association, and Shern was still the secretary. Back then, the International Bible Students Association and the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society worked very closely together. Well, Sunday, February 4th, the secretary of the London congregation read a letter from Brother Johnson that announced that Brothers Shern and Crawford were no longer managers of the Society's Britain branch. And now this is where we see Rutherford's true colors coming out regarding Johnson. Rutherford, who was recently voted in a month prior in January as the new president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society Corporation, had two different sides to contend with. He knew of what Shern and Crawford had been saying regarding Russell, what they wanted to do. But he also had all of these letters of disapproval coming in from the different brothers and sisters in the congregations regarding how they felt about what Brother Johnson had done. And there were some other matters as well. Shern and Crawford were original members of the Council of Five in the British International Bible Students Association, Inc. in London, which was incorporated June 30th in 1914. They were on the board of directors. Shern had been the main source of help at the London office for the Bible students who were facing the military draft, and by Johnson dismissing both of them from the London office, Shern's expertise and assistance was no longer available. Then, on February 4th, the British High Court ruled that elders were now subject to the draft as well. And as soon as Shern heard this, he came down on Johnson for not being able to take the final step which could have possibly saved the elders from this draft. Shern then sent letters to both the congregations and the Brooklyn branch that Johnson had interfered with his success in the military matters regarding the brothers. And this didn't sit well with Rutherford. He was already upset that Johnson had taken it upon himself to dismiss those two men. Rutherford felt that just because Johnson had written back to Brooklyn recommending Shern and Crawford's dismissal, it didn't give Johnson the right to dismiss them himself before he had heard from the executive committee in New York. Now, the brothers had this draft issue that they had to face, and the brother that was handling it was dismissed by Johnson, and it gets worse. On Sunday, February 18th, Johnson again appeared before the congregation. He spent 3 hours attacking Shern and Crawford. He had a host of witnesses from the congregations testify to his accusations regarding the two men's stance on Pastor Russell. 6 of the elders who had signed a resolution that was sent to Pastor Russell regarding separating the finances, as well as themselves as Russell as their spiritual leader, confessed that they were in their wrong and that their thinking was wrong, and they asked the entire congregations for forgiveness. But Shern and Crawford refused to do so. Now imagine this playing out at the Kingdom Hall. Multiple brothers are being accused of being divisive. 6 of these brothers ask for forgiveness from the congregation, admitting that they did wrong, but 2 brothers refuse to do so. What would you have thought? That obviously, since the other brothers admitted that they were wrong, that the 2 brothers must be wrong too, and that they aren't being repentant, but they're sticking by their stance. Well, this entire debacle that happened at the London Tabernacle and what Brother Johnson had done to both Shern and Crawford was reported throughout Britain and Ireland, and that shouldn't surprise you. As witnesses, we know how fast gossip can spread. On February 19th, Rutherford sent Johnson a cable showing his displeasure and told him to immediately reinstate brothers Shern and Crawford to their positions as managers. Johnson told Brother Rutherford he respectfully declined to reinstate the brothers at Rutherford's command. So Rutherford sent a cable to Johnson on Saturday, February 22nd, letting him know that he was going to appoint 5 prominent British elders to investigate the trouble that was happening. What was Brother Johnson's response? This cable. Brother Johnson was here telling Brother Rutherford that the experiences that he had in London foreshadowed those of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Mordecai. Most importantly, he claimed that since that fateful January 28th day, he was the steward mentioned at Matthew 28, having powers to dismiss those like Pastor Russell's. He even asked if Rutherford would be his right hand as Johnson had been for Russell. Remember, Rutherford asked Johnson who he felt was the successor to Russell as the faithful slave. So this cable was not only answering that question, but now Rutherford saw Johnson had put himself in place as that successor. After sending the cable to Rutherford, Johnson told Brother Henry that now everything was in Jehovah's hands. What did Rutherford do? He sent a cable to the office in London that same day. He said Shern and Crawford were to be restored to their positions immediately, and that they would have a fair trial before his commissioners. So this was war between Johnson and Rutherford. But Johnson wasn't aware what Brother Rutherford had done in Brooklyn Bethel while he had been away in London. Brother Henry, who once sided with Johnson, flipped to Brother Rutherford's side. He literally said that Johnson claims full control of everything, but that he resisted as Rutherford's representative. The dispute was between the managers and Johnson, not him. But he wanted to know, what exactly are Johnson's powers? Because Johnson did have that letter. What does Rutherford come back with? Johnson, demented, has no powers. Credentials issued to procure passport only. Return him America, sympathy. Then, that same day, the 26th, Rutherford sends a cable to Johnson telling him, your work finished, London, return America, important. But Johnson doesn't get that cable until February 28th, and when he did, he was shocked. I guess you could say it really took the wind out of his sails. He came back to the London Tabernacle on March 1st and kept a very low profile. By this time, Henry had completely changed from being an ardent supporter of Johnson to being his opponent, because Henry understood that the power now lied with Rutherford. Henry, trying to be a Christian elder and brother to Johnson, I guess, urged Johnson to go back to America at once and launch a claim there. But Johnson didn't think that that would be needed. Johnson just knew that Rutherford would come to see his position, just as he had many times before in their biblical discussions. After all, Johnson is the one that knew his Bible. He knew Hebrew and he knew Greek. He understood the scriptures much better than Rutherford did. It was Brother Rutherford who came to Johnson with questions, not the other way around. Johnson repeatedly cabled Rutherford, but Rutherford just ignored him. During that time, Johnson never did challenge Rutherford's authority. He did give up all of his official activities and declined any privileges from the brothers, as he was no longer a special representative of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. But that didn't mean Johnson gave up his personal claims of being the faithful steward. The committee that had been appointed by Rutherford to look into the London Tabernacle matter finally met in London, Bethel, on March 3rd through the 5th. A number of the brothers and sisters in the congregations appeared before them and testified against Brother Shern and the other elders who had sided with Brothers Shern and Crawford regarding their stance against Brother Russell. The chairman of the commission that Rutherford appointed was a Brother Thomas McCloy. McCloy really tried to get Johnson to testify, but Johnson truly felt that Jehovah would take care of the matter, and so he left it in Jehovah's hands and did not testify on behalf of himself. But something happened that made Johnson decide that Rutherford did not have the right to recall him. Johnson felt that Rutherford didn't have the right except at the board's direction. So since his credentials had been sealed by the society seal, Rutherford on his own couldn't just recall him without the rest of the board. He then told Henry that he was going to resume his activity as the special representative of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, as the board did not recall him. Well, Henry felt Johnson could remain at the London Bethel home as an honored guest. But Henry told Johnson not to touch anything regarding management. Then on March 7th, Johnson informed the entire Bethel family in London about his decision. He told them that if he were recalled by the board, he would immediately cease his activities. He informed them that he was going to resume his activity as the special representative of the Watchtower Society. Now, although many sided with Brother Johnson, Henry refused to. Henry looked at it as open rebellion against Brother Rutherford. But Johnson didn't just stop there. On March 7th, he sent a telegram to Brother Ritchie and Van Amberg, who had signed the letter to send him over to London. He demanded that he retain the powers that they had given him. that he wasn't subject to just Brother Rutherford. He was subject to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. He told Ritchie and Van Amberg that he had the ecclesia, or the congregation's backing, and that the ecclesia, the congregations, agreed that Shern and Crawford were wrong in both what they said and did. He told the brothers that he acted within the powers that they had given him and signed. Brother Johnson asked that Brother Ritchie and Brother Van Amberg please protest in God's name to the board about what was going on. And the same day, he dictated another letter to Ritchie, Van Amberg, and Brother Pearson to present to the board. He gave them 10 reasons against what Brother Rutherford had done. But Rutherford never allowed Brothers Ritchie, Van Amberg, or Pearson to do that. When Johnson would send a protest to the board asking the Friends for their help, Johnson would beg the brothers to tell Rutherford he didn't have the right to do what he was doing. And when he found out that Rutherford was on this new executive committee as president, he begged the brothers and sisters to have Rutherford removed because Rutherford did not deserve that. But Rutherford just dismissed these protests. See, what was going on at Brooklyn Bethel was complete upheaval and chaos. Somehow, while Johnson was away in London, Rutherford had taken complete control over the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society as the president. He had used his legal knowledge against the naive brothers there. So any letters sent to Brothers Ritchie, Brothers Van Amberg, Pearson, or anybody went unheeded. And that just upset Johnson. So on Monday, March 12th, at the Bethel table in the morning, he came out in full rebellion against Rutherford. After reading the January 15th Watchtower, Rutherford came to the conclusion that Rutherford had not been elected legally. So Johnson intended to take full charge of the British work in spite of being recalled by Rutherford. Well, Johnson and Henry got in a fight. Not physical, but verbal. Henry maintained that Rutherford did have the right to recall Johnson and cancel his financials. Johnson denied Brother Rutherford had that right. Johnson told Henry to get out of the office. Henry refused. Johnson drew up a document suspending Henry and had another brother formally witness it. Well, while he was drawing up this document, Henry received a telegram from the Watchtower Society saying that all of Brother Johnson's activities of every kind in the country had been canceled. Just say there was a whole bunch of going back and forth with the bank and with monies and just a whole bunch of internal business stuff. And while all of this was going on, Rutherford was sending cables to Henry telling him that Johnson was insane and that Rutherford had proof. Rutherford wanted Henry to get Brother Johnson arrested and thrown in jail immediately. But Henry wasn't able to do that. In fact, Johnson ended up taking Rutherford to court, and on March 17th, Justice Sargent of the High Court ruled that Johnson's credentials could only be canceled by the entire board, that it would take the society's seal and its officers' signatures to cancel Brother Johnson's credentials that they had given to him. Well, that empowered Johnson. He came in like a wrecking ball. He immediately dismissed Shern and Crawford as managers and expelled them from the congregation publicly at the next convention. He started telling everybody that he was the new faithful steward to take the place of Pastor Russell's. But news from New York had started trickling in that Rutherford had been elected as the new president, and that Rutherford was actually the new faithful slave. So the brothers and sisters stopped listening to Johnson. Those who were once ardent supporters started believing he had mental problems. There's a lot of stories out there about what happened to Johnson. I'll let you research those. But I will tell you this. The brothers started to treat Johnson horribly. I mean, lock him in a room. Horrible. There's a lot more that goes into it, but it basically has to do with the business side of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, who had the right to sign the checks, hold the monies, etc. There was a lot of hostility also between Brother Henry and Johnson. Finally, by March 26th, Johnson gave up any further attempts to try to take control of the Linden Bethel, either the businesses or as the faithful steward, and he sailed back to the States Sunday, April 1st, 1917. I kind of feel sorry for Johnson. He really went to Britain with full zeal, hoping to help the brothers and sisters because of the war that was going on. He wanted to encourage them, and he worked hard doing that, giving all of those public talks and discourses, going congregation to congregation. That would have been a very tiring thing. But at the same time, Johnson let a little power go to his head. But let me ask you a few questions. You can either just think about them or answer them in the comments. Why did Joseph Rutherford work so hard at discrediting Paul Johnson? Johnson was a highly respected brother when Rutherford, Ritchie, and Van Amberg sent him to Britain. Rutherford dictated that letter that Ritchie and Van Amberg signed, giving Johnson authority to act on behalf of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. So why didn't Rutherford support Johnson's actions? It was Johnson that Rutherford and Russell would go to for deep biblical conversations. So again, why did Rutherford work so hard at discrediting Johnson, both in Britain and in America, in New York? Why did Rutherford ignore all of Johnson's cables and telegrams? Well, that brings us back to Brooklyn, New York. And boy, had a lot happened there while Johnson was away in London. But that's for next time. Stay tuned to the end of this video. You'll see how Jeffrey Winder and what he thinks about this whole arrangement, what he thinks actually went on. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe so that this video goes out to a larger audience, algorithms and all. I love your comments, and please come back for next time as we go through the history of the organization, the wild history of the organization that's hidden and not in their history books. But in the meantime, as always, take care of yourselves and stay strong. Don't let those men in New York win. Thanks for watching.
The whole process described there. We see the use of God's word. We see the leadership of the Christ, the operation of the Holy Spirit, working through the brothers, taking the lead at that time. There's also humility there. Because again, none of the brothers are trying to force their idea or try to get their thoughts approved, but there is this collective, unified desire to see Jehovah's thorough process under prayer. And when there is unanimous accord, then the brothers take that as Jehovah's direction and then are happy to share it with the brotherhood.